In 100 hours of ground combat, one side lost 3,300 tanks. The other side lost zero. I mean zero to enemy fire. They did lose some tanks, and the reason for that is, well, just horrible, as you're about to hear. We're now telling you the horrors of tank crews on both sides of Operation Desert Storm, who saw some of the most intense armored combat since World War II. So, a bit of background first, because we're going into the story of tanks that were about to meet each other in, well, the most unexpected way. Iraq invaded Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. Huge force, 100,000 troops, and more importantly, about 700 tanks that just rolled across the border in a single night. And Saddam Hussein's army seized the entire country in 2 days. You have to remember, this was the world's 5th largest army, almost 1 million soldiers, over 5,000 tanks. So naturally, coalition forces were formed under Operation Desert Shield to counter this. A coalition of 39 nations, and for the Americans, their largest military deployment since Vietnam. So you've got over 3,000 tanks, thousands of fighting vehicles, and about 670,000 troops assembled in Saudi Arabia, getting ready to cross that border. American tanks formed the core of this force. And here's what's interesting about this. These tank crews had spent years training in West Germany preparing to fight Soviet armor, because that was seen as the most likely next major conflict. That was the big one everyone was getting ready for. But instead, they now found themselves about to fight those very tanks they'd heard so much about. Most notably the T-72 with its feared 125mm smoothbore cannon, which, and this is important, was actually the most powerful tank gun in the world when it first appeared. It scared NATO to upgun their tanks from 105 to 120mm, and now those T-72s were in Iraqi hands. So the American tankers, they were well prepared for the threat itself. They'd been exercising against targets built to resemble Soviet tanks and BMPs for years. What they hadn't trained for was the terrain they now found themselves in, the desert. So the tanks got their desert camo and, well, they were heading into the battle of their lives. And honestly, nobody really knew what to expect at the time. Let me give you the numbers because the scale here matters. The US Army deployed 1,956 M1A1 Abrams. Out of those, some 1,200 were the heavy armor variants, with those infamous depleted uranium inserts. And there were also 277 of the good old M60 patterns still in there. Britain came in with 221 Challenger 1 tanks, which was the largest British armoured deployment since World War II. But it wasn't just tanks that were the star of the show, because rolling alongside them were some 2,200 Bradley fighting vehicles. So before Operation Desert Storm actually kicked off, let's first take a look at what these tanks brought to the party, so you'd understand better what was about to happen. The Abrams, with its 120mm smoothbore gun, it had their beloved so-called silver bullet, which is actually the M1A1 a depleted uranium APFSD-S round. You probably already know how it works. It's fired from the cannon, sabot peels off, and the 4.6 kilogram depleted uranium penetrator flies toward the target at about 1,500 meters per second. Now, when it hits the enemy armor, unlike tungsten, it was self-sharpening on impact. So instead of flattening out, it stays sharp as it punches through. And it could penetrate an estimated 570 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at 2,000 meters. The effective range, though, that's much greater, because the projectile has this really flat trajectory, basically flying straight out to 3,600 meters. And as for penetration power, it was more than enough to destroy any tank in the world. And the T-72 was, well, certainly not an exception. In fact, and you're going to hear about this later, there is a documented engagement where one of these rounds penetrated and destroyed 2 T-72s with a single shot. But here's the thing. What really gave American tank crews the ability to actually use this round, to put it on target, was the fire control system. We're talking 95% first round hit probability at standard combat ranges. The system generated firing solutions automatically, and hitting something at 2,500 meters was not too difficult for it. Laser rangefinder accurate to within 10 meters, fully stabilized gun so you could fire effectively while on the move, and then, and this is the big one, thermal and night vision. That last part was about to become a deciding factor in the desert sandstorms and night battles that were coming, but we'll get to that. Now, as for protection, the Abrams is one of the best protected tanks in the world, and for good reason. Steel-encased, depleted uranium armor layered over Chobham-type composite armor, whose exact materials are, well, still classified. The depleted uranium gives it 2.5 times the density of steel, which makes the armor significantly harder to get through. But, and this is what you really need to keep in mind for what comes next, the Abrams had one of the most important features a tank can have. And that's the ammo storage designed with blast doors that blow outward away from the crew if the ammunition is hit. There's a thick steel door sitting between the ammo and the crew compartment, preventing the blast from going inside and blowing the turret clean off the tank. So if the worst happens and the ammo cooks off, the crew still has a chance. Speaking of blowing off turrets, let's now talk about the T-72 the Iraqis had, because this is where things start to look very different from the other side. So the biggest problem with the T-72 is how the ammunition is stored. It sits in an auto-loader carousel right inside the crew compartment, almost completely exposed to anything hot and sparky, like, oh, I don't know, a depleted uranium kinetic penetrator going straight through your tank. The tank commander and gunner were literally sitting on top of all the ammunition for their main gun. And, well, you've seen how this system has proved itself in the Ukraine war today. It was no different back then. The biggest problem is the propellant charges of that two-piece ammunition, which is basically a bag filled with a powder mixture. They had over 400 kilograms of it stored in there. And it really doesn't take much to ignite it and set off a chain of internal explosions that sends the 12-ton turret flying into the sky. You're also going to hear what the inside of a tank looks like when this happens. And I'm not talking about the tank itself, but about the squishy things inside it called people. Now, the Iraqi crews. This is where you need to understand that the Iraqi tank force was basically split into two completely different armies. On one side, you had the Republican Guard divisions. These were the real deal. Volunteers, not conscripts. Saddam's elite. These guys had 8 years of actual combat experience from the Iran-Iraq war, so they knew what fighting looked like. But here's the thing. That war taught them the wrong lessons. They fought Iran mostly from static defensive positions, trench warfare style, and that's exactly how they set up again in the desert. So they dig in, wait, and shoot at whatever comes into range, which sounds reasonable until you understand what was coming at them. So their best tank was the T-72 M1, and they had about 1,000 of them. Now this is an export variant from the Soviet Union, and the key word here is export. It wasn't what the Soviets kept for themselves. It's a deliberately downgraded version. No ceramic rod inserts in the armor, older ammunition types, and a whole list of other things the original T-72 had that this one didn't. Because the Soviets simply didn't want to reveal their most modern technology in tanks they were selling abroad. And this is actually important to understand, because the US Army basically admitted after the war that the myth of Soviet tanks being garbage came from the fact that everyone was judging Soviet armor based on these crippled export versions that the Soviets intentionally made worse. So when people say the T-72 was a bad tank, that's not exactly true. The T-72 the Soviets kept for themselves was a very different machine and much more dangerous. Now, as for what the Iraqis could actually shoot back with, their main anti-tank round, a steel kinetic penetrator, had already been withdrawn from Soviet frontline service around 1973. It could go through about 250 millimeters of armor at 2,500 meters, and the Abrams had roughly 800 millimeters of effective armor on the frontal hull and about 600 on the turret. So not quite an ideal situation to begin with. And to make matters worse, locally produced Iraqi gun barrels had a service life of only 120 rounds before the accuracy just fell apart. Not to mention the fact that many of these tanks had been used for years in the previous war, often as indirect artillery, so their barrels were nowhere near factory condition. And keep in mind, we're talking here about the best tank they had. The bulk of the Iraqi force were Chinese Type 69 tanks, which were basically a Chinese evolution of the Soviet T-54 with a 100mm gun and older Soviet T-55s, both of which could honestly be called obsolete for the time and for the tanks they were now about to face. And if all of that isn't enough, most of the Iraqi crews weren't those battle-hardened Republican Guard veterans. They were poorly trained conscripts who got old beaten-up tanks, didn't want to be there, and were told to hold the line against the most modern armor in the world. Morale was already low before a single bomb had dropped, and they were the ones sitting in the forward positions in the desert, the ones who were going to get hit first by everything. So what could possibly go wrong, right? They had no night vision capabilities except the lunar infrared searchlight and image intensification sights, which had only a fraction of the effective range the Abrams had and were nowhere near effective in dust and smoke. And here's what made it even worse. When those searchlights were activated, they became a highly visible beacon to anyone with thermal equipment, like, I don't know, an Abrams or Bradley gunner. So not only was it barely effective, it advertised the tank's position at night, basically screaming, "Shoot me." Meanwhile, the Abrams had a passive system that emitted nothing and detected everything, literally like a Terminator. Now, the Iraqi crews were instructed to battle sight their guns to a default range of about 1,800 meters because their analog ballistic computer was too complex and unreliable under combat stress. So anything beyond that range was basically guesswork. And even if they somehow managed to land a hit, like the T-72 that scored a direct hit on an Abrams at 400 meters, the round just bounced off. Like when Brad Pitt's Fury fired at Tiger 1 from point-blank range. Jokes aside, though, at least one thing was going in favor of the Iraqi tank crews, at least on paper, and that was position and defensive advantage. However, here's what went against them yet again, as they frantically dug in, preparing to meet what they knew was an inevitable tank charge across the open desert, and that was air power. Before any of these tanks even met each other, there were 6 weeks of bombing. And that's what actually broke the Iraqi army before the real fighting even started. A-10 Warthogs, Apaches, B-52 bombers flew over 100,000 sorties and dropped almost 90,000 tons of bombs before a single coalition tank crossed the border. That alone destroyed about 900 tanks and over 2,000 military vehicles, along with all sorts of other equipment and positions. And this whole time, Iraqi forward positions were just sitting there under constant bombardment, supply lines mostly cut, basically starving, waiting for either enemy tanks to finally appear or to get blown up from the sky. The ground war launched in the pre-dawn hours of February 24th, 1991. The plan was called the Left Hook, or the Hail Mary, and it was a massive flanking maneuver. While the Marines attacked directly into Kuwait from the south, and an amphibious feint kept Iraqi attention on the coast, the real striking force swept north through the undefended western desert into Iraq itself, then turned east to slam into the Republican Guard's flank. We're talking a 300-mile front, and the Iraqis never saw it coming. Their reconnaissance capability had already been destroyed by airstrikes. Their air force had either fled to Iran or was grounded, so they had absolutely no idea what was happening to their west. Now, from the very start, the experience for American tank crews was surreal. They drove straight into a sandstorm. Visibility dropped to 0 with the naked eye. You couldn't see the tank next to you. The only way to navigate was through thermal sights and early military GPS receivers. Everything, all of it, was done through instruments. Crews sat inside their Abrams for 100 hours straight, only getting out to go to the bathroom or refuel. The advance was fast. They drove at about 15 kilometers per hour across open desert, which doesn't sound like much, but it was faster than anyone expected, and, critically, faster than the supply lines could follow. The Abrams turbine engine burns fuel at roughly 8 gallons per mile, and the fuel trucks simply couldn't keep pace. So when tanks dropped to a quarter fuel tank, they had to stop and just wait for logistics to catch up before pushing forward again. They rolled through Iraqi defensive positions that had been devastated by 5 weeks of airstrikes. What they found was mass surrender on a scale nobody had anticipated. Marines captured nearly 10,000 prisoners on the first day alone. Allied forces stopped counting prisoners at 26,000 in 2 days. These were the frontline units, broken, starving, and wanting out. But the regular army's collapse was not the whole story, because ahead of the coalition advance, the Republican Guard was still there, dug in and waiting. So, February 26th, afternoon, 130 soldiers with 9 M1A1 Abrams, 12 M3 Bradleys, and 2 mortars, that's Eagle Troop. Their mission was to advance east as a screening force, find the Republican Guard, and fix them in place for the heavy divisions coming up behind. What they ran into was a brigade commanded by a man later referred to only as Major Mohammed. And Mohammed was no amateur. He was a graduate of the U.S. Army Infantry Officer Advanced Course at Fort Benning, Georgia, trained by the Americans themselves. And his defense was fundamentally sound. He had exploited an imperceptible rise in the terrain to set up a reverse slope defense. Roughly 40 dug-in tanks and 16 BMPs positioned about 1,000 yards east of the ridgeline, with 2 kill zones designed to destroy American tanks as they crested that rise and exposed their weaker top armor. Hundreds of infantry occupied bunkers and trenches between the armored vehicles, and a reserve of 18 T-72s sat along another ridge about 3,000 meters further east. Mohammed had done everything right, except for 2 things he could not have known. First, his reconnaissance vehicles had been destroyed in the days before, and the sandstorm prevented visual observation, so he had no warning of what was coming. And second, and this was fatal, he didn't know the Americans had GPS. He assumed they would follow roads, so he oriented his entire defense facing south, but the Americans came from the west. At 16:07 hours, Eagle Troop was advancing when a Bradley literally drove onto an Iraqi observation bunker. 2 soldiers came out and surrendered, but not before alerting the village ahead, and machine gun and cannon fire erupted, and then the call came in. Tanks direct front. 8 T-72s in prepared positions, visible to the naked eye at close range, but every single one of them was dug in facing south. Eagle Troop had hit the brigade on its completely exposed right flank. Within about 1 minute, everything in range was burning. The Iraqi 1st defensive line was now a wall of fire and smoke. As Eagle Troop pushed through it, they found additional vehicles and hundreds of infantry running between trench lines. Some Iraqis raised their hands to surrender, and American turrets turned away from them. But scouts discovered that some had used false surrender to reposition, picking up rifles and RPGs again. Bradleys killed them before they could fire. Meanwhile, Mohammed's reserve of 18 T-72s was trying to deploy, but they were destroyed at close range before they could even form a line. The main engagement lasted about 23 minutes. Eagle Troop destroyed roughly 30 to 50 tanks, accounts vary, 25 armored personnel carriers, 40 trucks, and hundreds of infantry. Eagle Troop suffered 0 casualties, not a single soldier killed or wounded. So that was the afternoon. Now, as darkness fell on that same day, February 26th, the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, began passing through the 2nd ACR's lines to continue the attack toward an Iraqi supply depot complex. The passage happened in total darkness, and what followed through the overnight hours became known as Fright Night, and it was probably the most terrifying experience any tank crew on either side had during the entire war. The conditions were just horrible. Overcast skies, rain mixed with smoke from Kuwaiti oil fires created this toxic, oily smoke, while hundreds of already burning vehicles made everything even worse. With the naked eye, all you could see was tracer fire going back and forth and tanks exploding and burning. You couldn't tell who was who. The only way to see anything at all was through thermal sights. And this is where the real horror came from for the American side. The battlefield was intermixed from the very start. As American units advanced past Iraqi positions, they discovered something terrifying. Iraqi tanks whose crews were in shelters or whose engines were cold didn't show up as threats on thermal sights. They were just dark shapes, same temperature as the sand around them. Coalition vehicles literally drove past enemy armor without knowing it was there. And then those Iraqi crews jumped in their tanks, started engines, and suddenly appeared right among the American formations. The result was 360-degree fighting with no clear front line, lines of tanks firing in every direction. And the Iraqis at this fight, they fought. This was not the surrendering front line. Iraqi infantry exited burning BMPs and attacked on foot. They physically swarmed coalition vehicles, trying to find openings to shoot through. As tanks passed depressions in the terrain, Iraqi fighters jumped from hiding with RPG launchers, trying to hit the vulnerable rear armor. But then, the complete chaos began. And this is the part that haunts the American veterans more than anything else from the entire war. Because through thermal sights, a hot vehicle is a hot vehicle. It doesn't matter if it belongs to your side or the enemy. At about 0200 hours, Bravo Company of Task Force 141 Infantry lost contact with its battalion. While trying to re-establish contact, the company drove into an Iraqi bunker complex. RPGs started hitting the Bradleys. And from the thermal sights of nearby M1A1 tanks, the RPG flashes and the Bradleys' movement looked identical to Iraqi tanks firing. American gunners, convinced they were looking at enemy armor, opened fire on their own Bradleys. One Bradley was hit by 2 rounds, killing 3 soldiers and wounding at least 3 more. The penetrators blew off the rear door, throwing the occupants into the sand. The company commander's replacement vehicle took a round through the left side and out the right rear, killing 1 soldier. A 3rd Bradley was hit, wounding another 3. The infantry in the back got the ramp down and set up a defensive perimeter, still believing they were under Iraqi fire. 2 hours later, around 0400, it happened again. A Bradley from Delta Company had driven into a bomb crater while rounding up about 20 Iraqi prisoners. M1A1 tanks spotted it, thought it was enemy, and put 3 rounds into its side. The driver was killed, and 2 of those rounds passed entirely through and struck another Bradley parked just 20 feet away, severely wounding its occupant. Both vehicles burned, and one of them, in its driver's words, melted to the ground. And it wasn't just Bradleys. 5 Abrams were also hit by friendly fire that night. 1 tank was first hit by an Iraqi RPG, and then by 3 American depleted uranium rounds. The gunner was killed, and the driver fled the vehicle partially blinded by diesel fuel. 4 other tanks that rushed to help were fired on by friendlies. When it was over, roughly 850 Iraqi tanks were destroyed in the broader engagement. But 6 Americans were dead and 32 wounded, and most of them not by Iraqi fire, but by their own. The next afternoon, February 27th, the war's second-to-last day, produced its largest single-tank engagement. The 1st Armored Division's 2nd Brigade, under Colonel Montgomery Meigs, found the Medina Luminous Division of the Republican Guard dug in behind a low rise, stretching about 7 miles. The Americans called it Medina Ridge. And again, the Iraqi defensive concept was tactically correct. They had set up a reverse slope defense with their T-72s and Type 69s dug in behind the ridge, with only turrets exposed, invisible to anyone approaching from the west, in theory. But thermal imaging defeated the tactic completely. Abrams gunners spotted heat signatures of Iraqi vehicles through terrain features that would have hidden them from any visual or optical observation. So it didn't matter how well they were dug in. The Americans could see them anyway. And to give you a sense of just how one-sided the visibility was, at 5 kilometers, the Americans could see the urine stream of an Iraqi soldier relieving himself in the bushes. And those Iraqi soldiers had no idea the Americans were even there. They didn't know until their own tanks started exploding around them. What followed was systematic destruction. The decisive phase lasted about 40 minutes, the broader engagement about 2 hours. Iraqi shells fell short, while Abrams rounds punched through T-72s from distances Iraqi gunners couldn't even see, let alone reach. An American brigade commander watched in amazement as his crews routinely scored first-round kills at 3,000 meters and beyond, ranges they had never even practiced at in training. The result: 186 Iraqi tanks and 127 other armored vehicles destroyed. 4 Abrams were hit, 3 repairable, 1 a total loss that was likely from friendly fire. And the only American killed in the 2nd Brigade's action was Specialist Clarence Cash, 20 years old, whose vehicle was struck by a friendly tank round. In 24 hours of nearly continuous combat, the broader brigade destroyed or captured 547 vehicles without the loss of a single vehicle of their own. But here's what needs to be said about the Iraqi side. Most of the Medina Division's crews died in their vehicles. They didn't abandon their positions. They knew their rounds were falling short. They knew they probably couldn't penetrate the American armor, and they stayed and fought anyway. Now, one incident from the 24th Infantry Division became legendary because it captures the entire technological gap in a single encounter. An M1A1 heavy armor. Abrams got stuck in the mud during the rapid advance and was left behind waiting for recovery. 3 Iraqi T-72s crested a nearby hill and attacked. The first T-72 fired a heat round from under 1,000 meters and hit the Abrams frontal armor. No penetration, and the Abrams fired back, and the depleted uranium round penetrated the T-72's turret and blew it into the air. The second T-72 also fired a shaped charge round into the frontal armor. Again, nothing, and the Abrams destroyed it. The round hit the engine and launched it into the sky. The third T-72 fired a sabot round from approximately 400 meters, which is point blank for tank combat. The round bounced off, leaving only a groove in the frontal armor plate, so that 3rd T-72 crew apparently decided this wasn't going to work and reversed behind a sand berm where they were completely hidden from view, but not from thermal sights. Through the thermal imager, the Abrams crew detected the hot exhaust plume rising from behind the berm. They aimed carefully and fired a depleted uranium round through the berm into the T-72, destroying it. One tank, stuck in the mud, against three, and the three never had a chance. But then, other American units arrived and were ordered to destroy the stuck Abrams to prevent it from being captured, so Abrams fired at their own tank. The first two rounds failed to penetrate the armor. A third, fired from a better angle, got through the outer turret skin and detonated stored ammunition. But the blowout panels functioned exactly as designed, venting the blast upward, and the fire suppression system put the fire out. Recovery vehicles eventually pulled it free later, and surprisingly the tank was found to be still operational, so they put a new turret on it and it went back into service. So when the fighting finally stopped, the desert was a tank graveyard. Roughly 3,300 Iraqi tanks destroyed, nearly 2,000 armored vehicles, over 2,000 artillery pieces, burned out hulks stretching across the sand for miles in every direction, turretless hulls everywhere, and American crews advancing through the wreckage were ordered to close their hatches because Iraqi ammunition was still cooking off in destroyed vehicles hours and even days after the fighting had ended. And what was left of the crews inside those tanks? Well, it wasn't really recognizable as people anymore. Body fat melted into the hull floors, and remains burned to charcoal that had to be removed through narrow hatches. The smell was something veterans mention over and over. Burned metal, burned fuel, burned flesh, all of it mixed together in the desert heat. The exact number of Iraqi soldiers killed will probably never be known. Estimates range from about 20,000 on the low end to over 100,000 on the high end. American losses were 219 killed, 154 of those in battle, and of those 154 battle deaths, 35 were from friendly fire. Another 72 Americans were wounded by their own side's weapons. The coalition lost 31 tanks, but not a single one of those was destroyed by Iraqi fire, 0. 20 of 28 Bradleys lost were hit by friendly rounds, not Iraqi weapons. And that, right there, tells you everything about what happened in that desert.